A 30-gallon water heater, the kind sitting in a basement right now, in probably half the houses on your street. If that tank fails, if the pressure relief valve sticks even once, it can punch through a roof and throw the tank itself more than 125 feet through the air at 85 miles an hour. That is the stored violence inside a household appliance you do not think about twice a year. Now, picture something the size of a delivery truck. Riveted iron, a coal fire roaring underneath it around the clock, pressure 10 times higher than that water heater, and it is sitting 2 floors below 300 people who are sewing leather, or feeding raw lumber into a saw, or winding silk thread onto a spool, with a factory whistle that already told them this morning they were not going home early. That machine had a name. Men called it the boiler. For almost a century, it was the heart of every mill in America, and it was also, quietly, one of the most efficient killers the Industrial Revolution ever built. Not a blade, not a gear. A sealed metal shell with a fire underneath it, doing the one thing pressure always tries to do when nobody is watching closely enough: getting out. Workers called the room around it the boiler house, but anyone who spent real time near one understood, somewhere in the back of their mind, that they were really just renting floor space next to a caged hurricane that ate coal instead of air. This danger did not start in the factories, and it did not start small. Between 1810 and 1840, boiler failures on the Mississippi River alone killed nearly 4,000 people, almost entirely on steamboats. That was the machine's first proving ground. By the time American factory owners adopted the very same design to run their mills, the death toll simply moved off the water and onto dry land, into buildings packed with workers who had no river to jump into and no riverbank to swim toward when the iron gave way. This is the story of the machine that powered the country, and occasionally erased entire buildings doing it. And before we get to the morning it went the furthest, we are going to ask the question that almost never makes it into the textbooks. How many of these boilers blew apart American factories before anyone in Washington finally wrote a law about how hard a man was allowed to run one? And when we went looking for what was left of that era, the actual steel, the actual boiler rooms where this machine lived, we found out something most people never expect. Some of it never left. Stick around, because where that story ends is not where you think it ends. The boiler that ain't Hartford. Before the boiler, a factory needed a river. Water wheels turned shafts, shafts turned belts, belts turned machines, and the whole arrangement only worked if your building sat next to fast-moving water. That was the old way, and the old way had a ceiling. You could only build where the river let you, and the river only gave you so much power, no matter how badly you needed more. The boiler broke that ceiling. Coal went in. Heat turned water into steam inside a sealed iron shell, and that steam, forced through pipes, could spin a shaft with the strength of 40 horses without a single drop of moving water anywhere near the building. A factory owner could now build wherever the railroad ran, hire however many hands he wanted, and run his machines as long as the coal held out. That was the promise. Power, anywhere, on command. Quantify what that actually meant. A water wheel was limited to whatever the stream behind it could deliver, and it stopped cold the moment a dry summer dropped the river too low to turn it. A single steam boiler could run 40 machines across 4 floors, day and night, in any season, anywhere a wagon could haul coal. Mill owners who switched from water to steam in the 1840s and 1850s were not chasing convenience. They were chasing a multiplication of output no river on the continent could match. And the price tag attached to that multiplication was a sealed iron vessel almost nobody yet fully understood. But pressure does not negotiate. It does not care if the shell holding it back was forged well or forged badly. It does not care if the man watching the gauge is paying attention. It only wants out, and it will use the first weakness it finds. That was the boiler's hidden nature from the very first one ever lit. And in the 1850s, almost nobody outside a handful of engineers understood it yet. Newspapers of the period had a phrase for it: the iron servant that might become the iron executioner. Early demonstrations of steam power up and down the East Coast drew crowds the way a circus might. Men and boys pressing close to watch a belt-driven saw rip through timber faster than 10 men with axes could manage in an hour. The applause did not last long. Word of an exploded boiler traveled by telegraph and newspaper just as fast as word of what the machine could build, and town after town learned to hold both feelings at once: awe at what steam could do, a cold understanding that the same machine, on the wrong morning, owed nobody an explanation before it killed them. So what happens the first time one of these things actually lets go? Hartford, Connecticut found out before almost anyone else in the country, and in the spring of 1854, something went wrong. The Fales and Gray Car Works built railroad cars, and on the 2nd of March that year, around 2 in the afternoon, the main boiler feeding the factory's machinery exploded without warning. Survivors described the sound less as an explosion and more as the building itself screaming for one single second before it simply stopped having walls. 9 men died within minutes. 12 more died in the days that followed, from burns and crushed limbs the doctors of Hartford had never been trained to treat. 50 more were carried out alive but broken. Pieces of the boiler itself were found scattered more than 200 feet from where it had stood. The blast leveled the blacksmith shop and the engine room and tore the walls out of the main building for 100 feet down its length. Hartford did not even have a public hospital. The city had to hold a public meeting just to figure out where to put the wounded. 2 months later, that meeting became Hartford Hospital, the first one the city ever had. The boiler had built something, even in the act of killing people. That pattern would repeat for the next 60 years. Every time this machine went off, it left behind either a body count or a new institution, sometimes both. Picture the size of the thing that did this. A large mill boiler of this era could stretch longer than a city bus, packed with thousands of gallons of water heated to a rolling boil, under pressure no human hand could ever hold back. It did not look dramatic, sitting still, just a long, riveted cylinder, bolted to a brick foundation, smoke curling lazily out of a stack overhead. That stillness was the trick. Nothing about its appearance told you whether the steel inside had 10 more years in it, or 10 more minutes. So could anyone actually stop the next one? That was the question hanging over Hartford in 1854, and for 12 years the honest answer was no. Then, in 1866, a handful of engineers from a Hartford discussion group called the Polytechnic Club did something nobody in the steam business had tried before. They started a company whose entire purpose was inspecting boilers before they failed and only selling insurance to the ones that passed. The Hartford Steam Boiler Inspection and Insurance Company. For the first time, somebody had a financial incentive to find the crack before the crack found you. It worked, and the numbers proved it fast. Between 1866 and 1870, the company's own records showed 279 documented accidents among boilers nobody had bothered to have inspected, against roughly 1 disaster for every 10,000 boiler years among the boilers that had gone through Hartford's program. That was not a theory. That was a measurable, repeatable difference between living through your shift and not. It did not. Because Hartford Steam Boiler could inspect anyone willing to buy a policy, it could not force a single factory owner in the country to let an inspector through the door. For the next half-century, whether the boiler under your floor was a sleeping danger or a safe one, came down to nothing more than whether your employer felt like paying somebody to go look. The seam that hid the crack. So what was actually happening inside one of these machines while it sat there, day after day, looking perfectly calm? Coal burns in a firebox. The heat passes along flues and around a water-filled shell, turning that water into steam under pressure, sometimes well over 100 pounds for every square inch of metal holding it in. That steam gets piped out to drive pistons, which turn a main shaft, which runs belts to every machine on every floor above. Fire, to water, to steam, to motion. One continuous chain, and at the center of it, a single sealed vessel doing all the work nobody upstairs ever had to think about. To build that vessel, boilermakers riveted curved iron or steel plates together using something called a lap joint. 2 plates overlapping by several inches, punched through with rivets, the edges hammered tight. It was strong. It was also, without anyone fully realizing it for decades, a hiding place. If a hairline crack started at the edge of one of those overlapping plates, it grew inside the lap, between the 2 layers of metal. completely invisible to an inspector running his hand or his eye over the outside surface. The very design that made the boiler strong enough to hold high pressure was also the design that let its fatal flaw grow in the dark. There was no national standard for the steel going into these shells either. One foundry's plate might differ in composition from another's, with no consistent testing program to catch a weak batch before it reached a boilermaker's shop. Lap joint construction stayed the default for decades simply because it was cheap and used tooling every shop already owned. Nobody chose the hidden crack on purpose. They chose the affordable method, and the hidden crack came bundled in for free. There were supposed to be two safety devices standing between a tired boiler and a catastrophe. A safety valve, meant to vent steam automatically once pressure climbed past a set limit, and a fusible plug, a soft metal plug set into the shell that was supposed to melt and release pressure if the water level ever dropped dangerously low and exposed bare hot metal. Both were good ideas. Both depended entirely on being properly sized, properly maintained, and never tampered with by a foreman trying to squeeze one more shift of output out of an undersized boiler. A safety valve weighted down to stop it from venting and slowing production was not a rare story in this era. It was a known temptation. So a hidden crack was only half the danger. The other half lived inside the firebox itself. If the fire was fed more fuel than the air supply could properly burn, unburned fuel could build up inside the firebox and flue passages, waiting for enough oxygen to reach it all at once. When that happened, the result was not a slow overpressure failure of the shell. It was a furnace explosion. A sudden ignition of accumulated fuel that could blow out doors, panels, and brickwork with almost no warning beyond a brief, wrong-sounding rumble from the fire itself. A hidden seam crack might take years to fail. A bad furnace could go up on a single shift. The men running these machines were managing two separate, mostly invisible threats every day, using instruments no more sophisticated than a pressure gauge, a water glass, and their own ears. Now, picture the actual force being contained. That household water heater. From the hook, 30 gallons, 90 pounds of pressure, 330 degrees, holds enough stored energy to throw its own steel tank over a football field through the air. A mill boiler was not 30 gallons. It could hold many thousands of gallons, run at far higher pressure, and sit directly beneath the floor where the workforce stood. When one of these things failed, engineers would later describe the released energy as comparable to multiple sticks of dynamite going off at once, inside a building with no warning beep, no countdown, nothing but a sound like the whole world tearing. So if the crack was invisible and the safety devices could be defeated, how did anyone know when a boiler was actually about to go? The honest answer for most of the 19th century was that you did not. You watched the gauge. You listened for sounds that seemed wrong. You hoped the man who built it years earlier had done careful work. That was the entire safety system for thousands of factories running this machine across the country. In the year 1880 alone, 159 separate boiler explosions were documented across the United States, and we already saw what the gap looked like between a mill that paid for inspection and one that did not. That gap was never subtle. It was the difference between a normal Tuesday and a funeral. The machine itself was a mystery even to the men who designed it, in the sense that nobody could see a crack growing inside a lap joint with the naked eye. But for the men who stood next to it for 10 hours a day, that mystery was not an abstract engineering problem. It was the air they breathed every single shift, whether they thought about it or not. And the cruelest part of that mystery was its patience. A boiler with a hidden crack did not necessarily fail on the day the crack formed, or even in the first year after. It could run for a decade, carrying a flaw that grew by fractions of an inch with every pressure cycle, lulling everyone nearby into a false sense that whatever had not killed them yet probably never would. That false confidence, repeated across thousands of mills for the better part of a century, is the real reason this machine managed to kill quietly for so long before the country finally treated it as an emergency instead of a cost of doing business. The men who fed the fire. Every mill that ran on steam needed a fireman to feed the coal and an engineer to watch the gauges. And these were not soft jobs. The boiler room ran hot enough that men worked stripped to the waist even in winter, shoveling coal into a firebox that never went out, breathing coal dust and ash for the length of an entire shift. The noise alone, the constant low roar of fire and the hiss of escaping steam, meant a man could be standing 3 feet from a warning sound and never hear it over the machinery. For most of the 19th century, becoming a stationary engineer required no license at all in most states. A man learned the trade standing next to an older engineer for a year or two, picking up habits, good and bad, that the previous man had survived long enough to pass on. Licensing eventually arrived in some states, but enforcement varied town to town, and plenty of small mills simply put whoever was willing in charge of the gauge and called it settled. Maintenance on these machines was its own kind of dangerous. Boilers had to be shut down periodically so a man could climb down inside the cooling shell and scrape mineral scale off the interior walls by hand, in a space barely large enough to crawl through, breathing dust that settled permanently into a man's lungs over a career. Fusible plugs had to be tested and replaced. Safety valves had to be checked for sticking. None of this work waited for a convenient moment, because a mill that stopped running was a mill that stopped paying its workers, and the pressure to keep the boiler lit outweighed almost everything else on the floor. In more than a few mills, workers did not even use the proper name for the thing. They called it the kettle, half as a joke, because joking about it was sometimes the only way to stand next to something for 10 hours that could end you mid-sentence and never give a reason why. That kind of nickname does not show up in an engineering manual. It shows up in the oral history of men who knew exactly what they were standing beside and decided to make peace with it anyway, because the wage was the wage, and the children needed feeding, regardless of what was hissing in the basement. Most of what almost happened never made the newspaper, which is exactly why it is so easy to forget today. Surviving inspection reports and company correspondence describe the ordinary, unglamorous near misses behind the disasters everyone remembers. A safety valve found frozen shut during a routine check. A fusible plug discovered already half melted before anyone scheduled its replacement. A water glass that had been reading wrong for days before a sharp-eyed fireman finally caught it. None of those stories carry a famous name or a death toll. They are the background noise of running this machine for a living. The version of the danger that never made headlines, because that particular time nobody died. Stand close enough to a working firebox, and the air itself could climb well past 120 degrees, even with every door and window in the boiler house thrown open. Men worked that heat in shifts measured in hours, not minutes, drinking water by the bucket, their skin baked red by a fire none of them ever saw the inside of, without flinching first. It was considered, by reputation, if not by any official ranking, one of the hardest and least forgiving jobs a man without a trade could find. And mill owners rarely had trouble filling the position, because somewhere down the hiring line there was always a man desperate enough to take it. How dangerous was this work? In numbers, nobody at the time wanted printed on the front page. In a single year, tracked by the insurance industry, 170 steam boilers exploded across the United States. They killed 259 people. They injured 555 more. And when that data was broken down by industry, the deadliest category was not railroads and it was not steel mills. It was sawmills, planing mills, and woodworking mills. 47 separate explosions in that single class of building in 1 year alone. The very word mill, the word sitting in the title of this video, was where this machine killed the most people year after year, with almost no public outcry to match the body count. So what was the worst job a man could draw on a shift like this? For a lot of crews, it was the scale scraping crawling into a vessel that had just been holding enough force to level a building, trusting that every valve on it had actually been shut and locked the way it was supposed to be. Men did it anyway, day after day, because refusing meant losing the job to somebody who would not refuse. And the warning signs, when they came, almost always came the same way. A little more pressure than yesterday. A little more noise in the firebox than yesterday. A gauge needle that crept a few pounds higher before anyone decided to push back. Men learned to live next to a slow-motion grenade because the alternative was an empty pay envelope. And across the country, in mill after mill, that grenade had been quietly ticking for decades. In one Massachusetts shoe town, by the spring of 1905, the clock on one particular boiler had already run out. Nobody standing near it that morning had any idea. The morning Brockton burned, the Grover Shoe Company made shoes, and made them well enough that the factory in Brockton, Massachusetts had expanded to 4 full floors to keep up with demand. The previous month, the shoe factories of Brockton together had shipped almost 56,000 cases of shoes, production running at an all-time high. Grover had added that 4th floor to keep pace with orders, and no surviving record shows anyone went back to ask whether a boiler sized for 3 floors of machinery could safely carry the weight of a 4th. More than 300 people worked inside the building, and on the morning of the 20th of March, 1905, most of them had just arrived for the day shift, looking to push that number even higher. The man responsible for the boiler that morning was an engineer named Rockwell. By his own wife's account, he had been irritable for days because the company was running an older boiler at a pressure she said it was, in her words, unequal to. That boiler had been inspected back in December and found in apparent good condition. It had been built in 1890, 15 years earlier, using exactly the kind of riveted lap joint construction that could hide a crack between 2 layers of metal for years before anyone on the outside ever saw a sign of trouble. At 7:50 that morning, Mrs. Rockwell looked out her kitchen window and saw her husband sitting near the boiler house. 5 minutes before everything went wrong, the boiler exploded with enough force to tear straight up through all 3 floors above it and blow out the roof. The floors did not just crack, they collapsed downward, one onto the next, burying workers under timber, flooring, and the heavy iron shoemaking machinery that had been sitting on top of them seconds earlier. A second explosion followed almost immediately, when the blast ignited a storage shed behind the boiler house holding naphtha, gasoline, and cement. Flaming debris rained down on a building that no longer had a roof to stop it. And with no roof to block the draft, fresh air poured straight into the wreckage and turned the whole site into what one witness called a 4-acre cauldron. People a half-mile away could hear the screams of workers trapped in the rubble as the fire spread. But one stitcher who had been working on the top floor felt the explosion collapse the building out from underneath her, dropped through 3 stories of falling timber, and crawled forward through the wreckage in a daze, only to discover she had crawled clean out onto open ground outside the building. She walked away largely unhurt. Many of the people standing near her that morning did not. Roughly 100 of the people inside escaped without serious injury. 58 did not survive. 150 more were injured, some severely enough to carry the damage for the rest of their lives, scarred by burns that never fully healed, or missing fingers and limbs that ended their working careers in a single morning. Survivors who walked away physically whole did not all walk away unmarked. Men and women pulled from that rubble alive went back to factory work for the rest of their lives, jumping at the sound of a steam whistle, unable to explain to anyone exactly why. The heat of the fire was so extreme that identifying the dead became its own tragedy. 39 of the victims were buried without ever being identified, in a single ceremony at Brockton's Melrose Cemetery 3 days later. A search of the wrecked boiler house turned up a charred body, a bent pocket watch, and a torn piece of clothing Mrs. Rockwell identified as her husband's. Investigators tore the ruined boiler apart looking for an answer, and they found one. A crack, hidden for years inside one of the riveted lap joint seams, exactly the kind of flaw no inspection of that era could have caught from the outside. The district attorney announced there would be no criminal charges. The explosion, he said, was caused by a hidden defect, impossible to detect in advance. Robbins Grover, the factory's owner, spent the rest of his own life trying to raise relief money for the families of the people who had died working for him, and the disaster cost him so much of his personal fortune that he never fully recovered financially either. What happened next said something about the town as much as the disaster did. Before the last body had even been recovered, Brockton's mayor and civic leaders organized the Brockton Relief Fund. which went on to distribute nearly $105,000 in direct cash assistance to grieving families while keeping its own administrative costs under 1/4% of every dollar raised. The Leather Workers Union added its own support, and the Boot and Shoe Workers Union alone eventually paid out more than $100,000 in insurance benefits to the families of the dead. Brockton's own governor at the time, William Douglas, was a shoe manufacturer himself, and in the months that followed, Massachusetts moved to create the strictest set of boiler laws anywhere in the country. A second factory boiler exploded elsewhere in Massachusetts less than a year later, and that follow-up disaster, arriving so soon after Brockton, made certain the public pressure for a real law never had a chance to fade. Nobody went to prison. Nobody was the villain in the way a courtroom understands the word. The villain, if this story has one, was a piece of riveted steel built 15 years earlier with a flaw nobody alive could see. Sitting under a building that had quietly grown to hold a fourth floor, the original boiler was never designed to support. But the country did not let the lesson disappear the way it almost had after Hartford. Massachusetts built the strictest boiler code in the nation by 1908. Other states copied it. The American Society of Mechanical Engineers formed its own boiler code committee in 1911, and in 1915 published the first national boiler and pressure vessel code in the country's history, with a National Board of Boiler and Pressure Vessel Inspectors following in 1919 to enforce it. 58 people died in Brockton, so that the rest of American industry could finally be told by federal authority exactly how much pressure a sealed vessel was allowed to hold before somebody had to answer for it. Brockton got a law within a few years. The factory that killed 58 people did not get a museum or even a plaque on the original site. Records show an automobile dealership went up where the Grover factory once stood within little more than a decade, followed eventually by a Studebaker showroom and a small grocery. The ground that absorbed that explosion has been paved, rebuilt, and repaved again for over a century. But Brockton was not the only town running this machine, and not every mill that depended on steam power got bulldozed and rebuilt into a parking lot. Some of them just got locked up. And in more than one case, the boiler room is still down there in the dark, sitting exactly the way the last man on shift left it, where the beast went to rot. Here is the part of this story most people never hear, because by the time anyone is curious enough to ask, the answer usually requires actually going and looking. The boiler that kills you does not survive killing you. It tears itself apart in the act, and whatever pieces are left get hauled away as scrap or buried in the rebuild. Every famous exploding boiler in American history, Hartford's, Brockton's, every one of them, is long gone. There is no museum case anywhere holding the actual metal that did the damage. That machine destroys the evidence of itself every single time, which is part of why this entire chapter of industrial history slipped so quietly out of public memory. What never got destroyed were its quieter brothers, the boilers that ran for decades and never failed, the mills that simply closed their doors one day, laid off the workforce, and never reopened, leaving every piece of equipment exactly where it sat on the final shift. Pulling a 40-ton riveted steel boiler out of a building with no working crane and no buyer lift waiting cost more money than the scrap is worth. So in mill after mill across the old industrial corridors of this country, nobody bothered. The machines just stayed. Take the Lonaconing Silk Mill in the small coal town of Lonaconing, Maryland, built in 1907, the same decade as the Grover disaster, and chosen for that location specifically because the town sat on coal, which meant cheap, constant fuel for exactly the kind of steam plant this entire story has been describing. At its peak around 1920, the mill employed 359 people, most of them women and girls from coal mining families who needed the wage as badly as any boiler room fireman ever did. In 1957, after decades of competition from synthetic fiber and cheaper modern mills, the Lonaconing Silk Mill closed its doors abruptly in the middle of a labor dispute and never opened again. What makes it different from almost every other dead mill in America is what happened next. Nothing. The machinery was never stripped out. The shoes, the lunch pails, the paper time cards, the spindles, all of it stayed exactly where the workers left it the day the doors locked. The roof has failed in places. Water gets in. The floors have started to rot in spots. But the steam-era machinery that powered this entire operation for half a century is, as of the most recent documented accounts, still sitting inside that building, decade after decade, in the same coal town where it was installed. The mill is privately owned, watched by cameras, and not open to the public without permission, which is exactly why so few people outside Allegheny County have ever heard this story. The site has been nominated for inclusion on the National Trust for Historic Preservation's list of the country's most endangered historic places. For decades, one local caretaker spent his own money trying to patch the roof and keep the building standing long enough to turn it into a museum, a project he never lived to finish. That is the honest answer to what counts as checking a site like this. Not trespassing through a hole in a fence, but following the photographs, the inspection records, and the accounts of the people who have actually been let inside, and confirming that yes, the machine is still there, exactly where the steam era left it. The people who walked those floors did not vanish from the record either. One woman who worked the mill in its final years started there as a teenager in 1948. Her own mother had worked the very same machines starting in 1924, at the age of 13. Her stepfather ran the floor as superintendent. Her aunt, her uncle, and her own boyfriend all clocked in at the same building. For families like hers, the steam plant humming under that brick floor was not an abstraction or a museum piece. It was 3 generations of household income tied to a single coal-fed machine in a coal town, in a building that is still standing today, specifically because nobody could afford to tear it down once the whistle stopped blowing for good. It is not the only one. Across the old textile corridors of New England and the coal regions of Appalachia, abandoned mills sit behind chain-link fences with their original boiler houses, smokestacks, and steam plant equipment intact, simply because nobody has ever found it profitable to clear them out. Urban explorers and historians who have documented these sites describe the same thing again and again. Massive boiler shells, rusted through in places, standing silent in rooms nobody has powered up in generations, while the buildings around them slowly lose their roofs to weather and time. A handful of sites, like the old iron furnaces preserved in Birmingham, Alabama, were rescued and turned into protected landmarks with guided tours. Most were not. Most are simply still standing, unguarded and unrestored. Because demolishing a 40-ton steel relic costs more than the land underneath it is worth to anyone. What finally killed this version of the machine was not a single law. It was electricity. Once factories could buy power off a grid, instead of generating their own with a coal fire and a boiler the size of a room, there was no longer any reason to keep one massive, centralized, dangerous pressure vessel running underneath an entire workforce. Smaller motors, distributed wherever a machine actually needed power, slowly replaced the giant central steam plant through the 1920s, 1930s, and beyond. The boiler did not disappear from American industry. It still runs in modern plants, in modern hospitals, in modern heating systems, today. It just stopped being the single point of failure for an entire building. And once the American Society of Mechanical Engineers Code became the law of the land, the rate of catastrophic explosions fell from a near-daily occurrence in the boiler's reckless youth to an event so rare today that most working engineers will never see one in their entire career. That part of the story almost never makes it into the documentaries. The machine that used to kill hundreds of people a year became, under enforced regulation, one of the safest pieces of industrial equipment in the country. Remember the hidden crack from earlier in this story, the one growing silently inside a riveted lap joint where no inspector's eye could reach it. That flaw did not survive the century either. Engineers eventually phased out riveted lap joint construction altogether, moving toward welded and seamless steel shells that closed off the exact hiding place a crack like Brockton's had used to grow undetected for 15 years. The fix came late for the men who already paid for it, but it came, and it stuck. And it is the reason nobody growing up today has ever heard a news story about a factory boiler erasing a city block. So here is the answer to the question we opened this video with. How many of these boilers blew apart American factories before the law finally caught up to the physics? We may never have an exact number, because for decades, nobody outside the insurance industry was even counting consistently. And the worst kind of explosion erases its own evidence. But the machine that did the damage, the actual killer boilers, those are gone, every one of them. Vaporized in the moment they did the thing that made them famous. What is still down there, behind padlocked doors, rotting under failed roofs in dead mill towns from Maryland to Massachusetts, are its unexploded brothers and sisters. The ones that ran their entire careers without ever going off, then simply got left behind when the industry that built them moved on to electricity, to diesel, to machines small enough not to require a boiler room at all. That is the real legacy of this machine, and it cuts both ways. Exactly the way the best and worst inventions always do. The same boiler that flattened a 4-story shoe factory and killed 58 people in one morning also dragged American industry out of the riverbank and into the modern factory floor in town after town for the better part of a century. The same disaster that buried Brockton in fire and grief is the direct reason every pressure vessel built in this country since 1915 has to meet a federal code before anyone is legally allowed to light the fire underneath it. Progress and the body count that paid for it arrived in the same crate, riveted shut, and delivered without a warning label. Walk past a working factory or hospital boiler room today, and you will probably never think about any of this. That is, in its own way, the whole point. The modern version of this machine is boring on purpose, wrapped in code requirements, logged inspections, and pressure relief systems engineered to fail safely instead of catastrophically. Boring is what safe looks like. Once enough people have died to make boring mandatory. The men who fed the fire in 1854, in 1905, and in every anonymous sawmill that never made a headline, never got to work next to a machine that boring. They absorbed the cost of every lesson learned with their own bodies so it could eventually become someone else's background noise. The boiler stopped being the villain the day this country finally decided that pressure needed a witness. It only took a hidden crack, one overworked engineer, and 58 bodies in a Massachusetts shoe factory to finally write that rule down. Everywhere else, in every dead mill still standing behind a fence tonight, the machine never got the memo that its era ended. It is just sitting there, quiet, cold, rusting through at its own pace, waiting for absolutely nothing, because the fire underneath it went out for the last time decades ago, and this time, nobody is ever going to light it again.